The string lights suspended over the flagstone patio were flickering slightly out of rhythm with the low jazz drifting from the open French doors. It was a minor electrical inconsistency, the kind of detail my brain automatically flagged and cataloged, completely bypassing the actual atmosphere of the summer evening. That was the void I lived in. Numbers, patterns, and broken systems. I was a forensic accountant, a professional ghost who specialized in dismantling hostile financial structures, and my daily reality was a sterile sequence of identifying errors. The party inside was supposed to be a celebration for Connor, my oldest friend, finally landing his architecture firm partnership. I had stepped out onto the breezy afternoon porch to escape the noise, loosening the stiff shoulders of my navy suit jacket. I wasn't expecting anyone else to be out here. Amelia was leaning against the heavy wooden back of a teak garden chair. She wore a fitted white-ribbed tank top that contrasted sharply with the fading evening light, her black-rimmed glasses sliding a fraction of an inch down the bridge of her nose. Silver hoop earrings caught the ambient glow of the patio bulbs as she tilted her head. Connor's mother. I stood facing her, the physical blocking of the narrow patio forcing a proximity that made the air feel suddenly dense. Connor had just walked back inside after complaining, loudly and with a drink in his hand, about his disastrous dating life, gesturing wildly about the immaturity of the women he was seeing. I had leaned against the stone pillar, entirely exhausted by his monologue, and delivered the deadpan line just as he walked away. "Your mom is hotter than half the girls I've dated." It was supposed to be a dry, compartmentalized fact, a passing comment meant for the wind. Amelia didn't miss a beat. She pushed the glasses back up her nose, a quiet, assessing calculation in her expression. "So," she said, her voice dropping into a register that commanded the space entirely. "Want to go out with me?" The jazz music inside seemed to drop an octave. A sudden stillness settled over the patio, physically blocking out the chatter from the living room. I didn't laugh, and I didn't deflect. I simply looked at her, registering the absolute lack of irony in her posture. The invitation hung in the air, a definitive, irreversible change to the architecture of my carefully structured life. The next morning, the smell of roasted espresso beans in my downtown office was sharp and medicinal. I was running a background trace on a corporate shell company when my intercom buzzed. My assistant didn't announce the name, only that someone with an urgent, verifiable appointment had arrived. When I opened the frosted glass door, Amelia was standing in the reception area. The breezy confidence from the patio was replaced by a rigid, pragmatic tension. She wasn't here to follow up on the joke. She was here seeking a safe, temporary workaround for a disaster. She held a thick manila folder, her knuckles white against the paper. "I need a professional," she said, her tone entirely stripped of the warmth from the night before. "I will pay your standard hourly rate, Jaxon. This isn't a favor." I gestured to the leather chair opposite my desk. "Sit down. Tell me the problem." She opened the folder, revealing a formal notice printed on heavy, intimidating legal stock. "My commercial landlord. He's citing a gross receipts discrepancy under Clause 4B of my lease. He's demanding a retroactive payment of $40,000 by the end of the month, or he initiates eviction. I don't have $40,000. If I lose the studio space, I lose the inventory, the foot traffic, and the business." I pulled the document across the desk. The bureaucrat. I knew the archetype well, a landlord who weaponized complex lease language to bleed small business owners who didn't have the legal budget to fight back. I maintained my measured, calm demeanor, a learned reflex from years of high-stakes audits. I didn't offer empty platitudes. I looked at the numbers. "He's using a cumulative calculation on your net sales, but he hasn't accounted for the municipal tax deductions in your specific district," I said, my voice dropping into a smooth, quiet authority. "It's a manufactured default." Amelia exhaled, a shaky, uneven breath that seemed to lower the temperature in the room. "Can you stop him?" "I can," I said, sliding the folder into my active tray. "But we have to move quickly. And we meet in public, during daylight hours, to keep the chain of custody clean on these documents." I established the boundary instantly, a necessary restraint. The threat was real, and the leverage the landlord held over her was concrete. We were on the clock. We met at a corner coffee shop 3 days later. The midday sun cut through the large glass windows, casting sharp shadows across the scattered spreadsheets I had printed out. The espresso machine hissed in the background, a steady, mechanical white noise. I kept my hands folded on top of my laptop, deliberately keeping my physical distance. The age gap insecurity wasn't just a social construct. It was a constant, low-level hum of friction. Connor was my friend. Amelia was a woman nearly a decade my senior, established, grounded, and currently watching me dismantle a 300-page commercial lease. "Look at Schedule C," I instructed, pointing the tip of my silver pen at a dense paragraph without letting my hand brush hers. The landlord included a gross-up provision for the common area maintenance. He's charging you for operating expenses as if the building is 100% occupied, but public records show he's holding 2 units vacant for a tax write-off. He's shifting the deficit onto you. Amelia leaned in, her eyes scanning the complex legal jargon. The scent of her subtle vanilla perfume cut through the bitter smell of roasted coffee. "Is that legal?" "It's a gray area that relies on the tenant not knowing how to run a pro forma reconciliation," I explained, keeping my tone clipped and precise. I devoted exactly 90 seconds to explaining the Section 179 depreciation manipulation he was attempting, dropping the technical terms clearly to establish the exact parameters of our defense. I stopped immediately when I saw her shoulders drop. "So I don't owe it," she stated, the realization hitting her like a physical relief. "You don't owe a dime," I confirmed. I almost reached out to touch her arm to ground her, but I pulled the impulse back, keeping my hands resting firmly on the table. The restraint was a conscious, heavy choice. I chose to meet her in daylight first, respecting her comfort and the professional boundary we desperately needed to maintain. The tension wasn't in what was said, but in the deliberate, careful space I maintained between us. The resistance came on a Tuesday evening. I was working late on her patio, the only time she had free after closing the studio. The weather had turned humid, the air thick and sticky. Connor had dropped by unannounced to pick up a package his mother had held for him. When he walked through the gate and saw my laptop glowing on the teak table, surrounded by highlighters and empty coffee mugs, he stopped. "Jax, what are you doing here?" Connor asked, his brow furrowing. The unspoken boundary of our friendship seemed to vibrate in the humid air. Amelia stepped out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel. She froze, sensing the sudden shift in the atmosphere. This was the friction point. I could have downplayed it. I could have acted like a subordinate hired hand. Instead, I closed the laptop with a quiet snap. "I'm running a forensic audit on your mother's commercial lease," I said smoothly, my voice devoid of apology. "Her landlord attempted a fraudulent CAM charge acceleration. I'm building the counterclaim." Connor blinked, the defensive posture slowly draining out of him as the technical reality of my words landed. "Fraudulent? Is she going to lose the studio?" "No," I stated plainly. I didn't look at Amelia. I kept my focus entirely on Connor, shutting down any speculative rumor with receipts, not speeches. "I have the documentation. We're finalizing the response tonight." Amelia walked over and set a fresh glass of iced water down next to my laptop. The condensation dripped onto the table. "Jaxon has been putting in 70-hour weeks," she said quietly. "He's saving the business, Connor." Connor nodded slowly, accepting the practical reality over the social awkwardness. When he left, the silence on the patio was heavy. I opened the laptop again, staring at the glowing cells of the spreadsheet. I didn't say a word, I just returned to the work, the quiet, steady rhythm of my keystrokes acting as a shield against the chaos of the evening. It was a domestic anchor, this shared silence over the numbers. It was the only way I knew how to show loyalty. The routine settled into our bones over the next 2 weeks. I would arrive at her studio after hours carrying a cardboard tray of black coffee. The studio smelled of raw canvas, turpentine, and old wood. We worked in parallel. She organized her inventory, I dissected the landlord's banking history. The micro joys were in the logistics. She began leaving a specific green ceramic mug out for me. I began adjusting the erratic thermostat in the back office without being asked, noticing she always shivered around 8 o'clock when the central air kicked into high gear. One evening, a sudden summer storm broke over the city. Thunder rattled the large glass storefront of the studio. Amelia was up on a small stepladder trying to adjust a heavy display shelf. The ladder wobbled. I moved across the room in 3 long strides, grabbing the aluminum side rails and locking my stance to stabilize it. "I've got it," I said, my voice low and steady to cut through the noise of the rain hitting the roof. "Take your time." She looked down at me, her hands gripping the wooden shelf. For a long moment, the external pressure of the audit and the storm faded. My hands remained clamped entirely on the metal ladder, strictly avoiding contact with her, but the transfer of stability was absolute. She exhaled a shaky breath, the tremor leaving her arms as she anchored the shelf. I watched the resilience in her tired eyes, admiring the sheer grit she possessed to keep this place running alone. When she climbed down, she stood close, the smell of rain permeating the room. I kept my hands firmly at my sides, my jaw tightening against the instinct to pull her into the quiet room of an embrace. The tension was entirely in the respect I forced myself to maintain. The Midpoint twist arrived via email at 4:15 p.m. on a Thursday. I was at my office when the notification pinged. It was a legal notice from the Landlord's Council. They weren't waiting for the end of the month. Because I had subpoenaed the building's maintenance logs, they activated a hidden insecurity clause in the lease, demanding an immediate escrow deposit of the disputed $40,000 within 48 hours, or they would lock the doors on Friday night. I printed the notice, grabbed my coat, and drove straight to her studio. When I walked in, Amelia was standing behind the register, her phone in her hand, her face pale. She had received the copy. "He's locking me out," she whispered. "Tomorrow." I walked around the counter. The ambient noise of the street traffic outside seemed to vanish. "He's trying to induce a panic default," I said, my voice deliberately calm, a tactical anchor in the sudden freefall. "It's a pressure tactic. The clause is unenforceable if the underlying charge is currently under formal legal dispute. Jaxon, I can't fight a lockout. If my clients show up on Saturday and see a padlock on the door, my reputation is done. The business is dead." She dropped the phone onto the counter, her hands coming up to cover her face. It was the first time she had broken. I stopped fighting my own restraint. I stepped forward and wrapped my arms around her, pulling her into a solid, grounding hug. I didn't pull her close for warmth. I pulled her in to physically block out the collapse of her world. The sudden silence that settled over me was absolute. The embrace was a shield, a transfer of stability. I felt the rigid panic in her spine slowly begin to melt. "I am not going to let him put a padlock on your door," I said, speaking the words into the quiet space between us. "I have the finalized audit. I have the proof of his municipal tax fraud. We are going to his office tomorrow morning, and we are going to end this." She pulled back, her eyes searching mine for any sign of hesitation. She found none. She nodded, wiping a stray tear from her cheek, her agency returning as the panic subsided. "Okay. What do we need to do?" The next morning, the social friction reached its peak. Connor called me at 7 a.m., He had heard from a mutual friend that I had been seen leaving Amelia's studio late at night multiple times. The tone of his voice was tight, accusatory. "Jax, what the hell is going on with you and my mother?" I stood in my kitchen staring at the black coffee in my mug. This was the second obstacle. The threat of losing my oldest friendship over a relationship I hadn't even fully defined yet. I chose the hardest, honest answer. "I am representing her in a hostile commercial dispute," I said cleanly, "and I care about what happens to her. I am not hiding anything from you, Connor, but I am not going to step away from this. She needs this fixed today." There was a long pause on the line. I didn't fill the silence with apologies. Finally, Connor exhaled heavily. "Just don't let her lose that studio, Jaxon." "I won't," I promised. I hung up the phone, a heavy weight lifting from my chest. I had chosen not to win an argument, but to maintain the truth. At 9 a.m., Amelia and I walked into the landlord's management office. The bureaucrat sat behind a massive mahogany desk, a smug, dismissive smile on his face. He clearly expected Amelia to come in pleading for a payment plan. He didn't expect the forensic accountant standing beside her, carrying a locked briefcase. "Ms. Daniels," he said, leaning back, "I assume you have the escrow check." I didn't wait for Amelia to speak. I stepped forward, opening the briefcase and laying 3 meticulously tabbed binders onto his desk with a heavy thud. "My name is Jaxon Hart," I said, my voice projecting a soft-spoken power that immediately erased his smile. "I am a forensic accountant representing Ms. Daniels. We do not have a check. We have a 50-page audit detailing your fraudulent application of Section 179 deductions, your unauthorized gross-up charges on vacant units, and the subsequent municipal tax discrepancies you filed last quarter." The landlord sat forward, his eyes darting to the binders. "This is absurd. You have no legal standing." I cut him off, negotiating a hard boundary instantly. "I have bank logs, maintenance invoices, and the city tax registry. Clause 4B of her lease is nullified by your breach of covenant. If you attempt to place a padlock on her door tonight, I will forward these 3 binders to the State Attorney General's office for commercial fraud before the close of business today." I refused the manipulative clause he had weaponized, dismantling his leverage completely with measurable reality. The room went completely quiet. The only sound was the hum of the air conditioning. The landlord looked at the binders, then looked at me, realizing he was entirely outmatched. He had tried to bully a small business owner, and he had walked into a tactical trap. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice tight with controlled rage. Amelia stepped forward. This was her power moment. I deliberately took a half step back, yielding the floor to her. She didn't look back at me for permission. She looked directly at the man who had tried to ruin her. "I want a revised lease," Amelia stated, her voice steady and clear, making a public boundary statement that freed her from his control. "I want the CAM charges permanently capped, the insecurity clause stricken, and a 10-year renewal option at a fixed rate. You will draft it today, and you will sign it while we watch, or we go to the Attorney General." He stared at her, the reality of his defeated position sinking in. Slowly, he picked up his phone and pressed a button. "Get legal down here," he snapped. "We need to draft a lease amendment." The falling action was swift. We sat in his conference room for 2 hours while the lawyers scrambled to rewrite the terms. When Amelia finally signed the new document securing her business for the next decade, she didn't cheer. She just closed the pen and slid the paper across the table. We walked out of the building into the bright midday sun. The oppressive weight that had hung over the past month was entirely gone. "You did it," I said, stopping on the sidewalk. "We did it," she corrected, looking up at me. The adrenaline of the fight was fading, replaced by a quiet, profound exhaustion. "I don't know how to thank you, Jaxon." "You don't have to," I said, keeping my hands in my pockets. The urge to hold her was a heavy pull, a magnetic gravity that I fought with every ounce of discipline. I need to go file these copies at my office. I'll call you later. I walked away, choosing restraint. I wasn't going to turn the relief of a business victory into an emotional transaction. 2 days later, the resolution arrived in the form of a quiet invitation. Amelia had asked me to come to the patio on Saturday evening. When I arrived, the string lights were glowing steadily, the electrical issue fixed. The patio was set up for a small gathering. Connor was there, along with a few of Amelia's close friends and studio employees. It was a celebration of the new lease. I stood by the edge of the stone wall, holding a glass of sparkling water, watching Amelia move through the small crowd. She looked lighter, the burden of the threat completely erased. Connor walked over to me, holding a beer. "You did good, man," Connor said quietly. "She told me what you pulled in that office. Thank you." "She's the one who held the line," I replied, deflecting the praise. A few minutes later, Amelia tapped a spoon against her glass. The small crowd quieted down. She smiled, looking around the patio. "I just want to thank all of you for being here," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the warm night air. "This month was terrifying. I almost lost the studio. But I didn't, because I had someone standing beside me who refused to let me fall." She turned and looked directly at me across the patio. It was a public acknowledgement, a clear, definitive choice. "Jaxon, thank you for being my shield. And my partner." She walked across the flagstone, leaving the crowd behind, and stopped directly in front of me. She didn't say anything else. She reached out and took my hand, intertwining her fingers with mine. The physical contact acted as an absolute grounding wire. The world stopped spinning. The isolation and the sterile efficiency of my life completely dissolved in the warmth of her grip. I looked down at her, the noise of the party fading into the background. I didn't need to make a grand speech. I leaned in and pressed my lips to hers. It was a soft, gentle kiss. It wasn't an exploration. It was a destination. The feeling of finality, of absolute certainty, washed over me like dropping a heavy anchor in a safe harbor. The wandering was over. Looking back now, I realize that true integrity isn't just about fighting the right battles. It's about standing beside someone when the odds are impossible and choosing what is real over what is expected. Winning the wrong way is actually losing. True victory is sleeping with a clear conscience, knowing you protected the people who matter.
Please like and subscribe so we can share more stories like this.